On the night of March 9th, 1945, American bombers attacked Tokyo in Operation Meetinghouse. Within hours, large sections of the city were burning. Fire services were overwhelmed almost immediately. Roads clogged, communications failed, and entire districts lost any coordinated response. By the time the raid ended, Tokyo had suffered more destruction than in any other conventional air attack in history. This was not the result of a single bomb, a single error, or a moment of lost control. It was the outcome of a deliberate shift in how the United States chose to wage air war against Japan. A shift shaped by years of failure, constraint, and hardening belief. To understand why Operation Meetinghouse unfolded the way it did and why it proved so devastating, you have to look beyond the night itself, to the assumptions about air power that no longer held. The destruction of Tokyo on a single night did not begin with fire. It began decades earlier with a set of beliefs about air power that hardened long before the Second World War reached the Pacific. In the years between World War I and World War II, military planners across Europe and the United States became convinced that modern conflict could be decided from the air. They argued that industrial societies were fragile systems, and that if factories, transport networks, and power generation could be disrupted, an enemy's ability to fight would collapse regardless of what happened on land or at sea. This vision depended upon control. Bombing was not imagined as indiscriminate destruction, but instead as a rational, disciplined instrument of war. Precision was central to that idea. Accurate bombing promised decisive results whilst preserving order, predictability, and restraint. The United States embraced this belief deeply. It shaped aircraft design, crew training, and institutional identity. Bombers were built to fly high above most defenses. Crews were trained to navigate long distances and release bombs using instruments, calculations, and standardized procedures. Success was measured by accuracy, by how closely bombs landed to their intended targets. Precision was more than a tactic. It was how air power maintained the appearance of control. And moving away from it meant accepting outcomes that could no longer be tightly predicted or contained. When the United States entered the war, the doctrine of precision bombing was tested immediately. Over Europe, American bombers encountered conditions that challenged nearly every assumption planners had made. Weather-disrupted formations, anti-aircraft fire scattered planes, and enemy fighters forced evasive action. Even when crews flew exactly as trained, bombing accuracy often fell far short of expectations. Targets were missed by wide margins. Post-mission assessments revealed how difficult it was to translate theory into results. Yet Europe still appeared to partially validate the underlying belief that industrial targets were often geographically distinct. Rail yards, factories, and power stations could be identified as discrete objectives. Even when bombing accuracy was poor, damage could still accumulate over time. However, Japan presented a fundamentally different problem. The Japanese home islands lay beneath persistent and complex weather systems. Upper-level winds were strong and unpredictable. Cloud cover was frequent and often unbroken. Crews could plan meticulously, only to find targets obscured or bomb trajectories distorted beyond correction. Bombs released from high altitude drifted far from their aiming points, and entire formations could miss intended targets by miles. Crews completed long, dangerous missions and returned to base having achieved little confirmed damage. These were not isolated failures. They happened again and again. And despite being the political and industrial heart of Japan, Tokyo remained largely intact well into the later stages of the war, because the methods used against it were poorly suited to the environment it occupied. Tokyo did not resemble many Western industrial cities. Heavy industry existed, but it was based alongside residential areas rather than separated from them. Small workshops operated beside homes. Labor lived close to production. The city was dense, and much of its housing relied on light construction materials, such as wood and paper. The streets were narrow, and fire breaks were limited in scale and spacing. These characteristics were well understood by American planners in theory, but what proved difficult was translating that understanding into effective action. High-altitude precision bombing was ill-suited to exploiting such conditions. Unlike with the war in Europe, missing a factory by several hundred meters did not necessarily damage a related facility. Often, it achieved nothing of strategic value at all. As the war intensified and pressure mounted on the strategic bombing campaign, aircraft production increased and crew losses accumulated. Fuel, time, and industrial capacity were consumed at enormous scale without delivering decisive results. American commanders faced a growing contradiction. The more faithfully the precision bombing doctrine was followed, the less effective the campaign appeared to become. Rather than abandoning precision outright, planners attempted to adapt it, but by late 1944, the gap between expectation and outcome had become impossible to ignore. Strategic bombing had become a central pillar of American war planning. Its success was assumed, but its results over Japan remained limited. At the same time, intelligence assessments began to change in character. Analysts focused less on individual factories and more on the structure of Japanese cities themselves. They described urban areas as tightly coupled systems. Housing, labor, transport, and production were inseparable. Damage in one area rapidly spread into others. Disruption was not isolated. Tokyo, in particular, appeared less like a collection of discrete targets and more like a single organism. This perspective revealed a different kind of vulnerability. It also raised a harder truth, that precision bombing could not always maintain control. The eventual shift was therefore not framed as innovation, but as a necessity. Planners reassessed the constraints they had imposed upon themselves. Bombing altitude was no longer treated so rigidly. Payload composition was reconsidered. The objective shifted from pinpoint destruction towards systemic disruption. Lower altitudes reduced the influence of upper-level winds and improved bombing effectiveness despite the increased exposure to anti-aircraft defenses. Precision bombing was deliberately deprioritized. This was not a move toward greater control. It was an acceptance that control would be reduced. Commanders understood that once fires began interacting across wide areas, outcomes would be difficult to predict and shape in real time. The goal was no longer to manage events as they unfolded, as per the previous doctrine of precision bombing, but to instead create initial conditions that would carry momentum of their own. What could still be influenced was how those conditions were set, but what could not be controlled was how far they would spread. When the raid began, it did not unfold like earlier bombing missions. Operation Meetinghouse commenced on the night of March 9th and continued into the early hours of March 10th, 1945. The attack was concentrated on the eastern half of Tokyo, particularly the low-lying Shitamachi districts along the Sumida River. These areas included neighborhoods such as Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, and Sumida, districts dominated by dense wooden housing, small workshops, and narrow streets where residential and industrial life overlapped almost completely. The first American B-29 bombers reached Tokyo shortly before midnight. Their initial task was not mass destruction, but positioning. Incendiary cluster bombs were dropped to ignite broad target zones across these eastern districts, creating fires that could be seen from long distances and used as reference points by later aircraft. These initial fires were given time to spread before the main bomber force then arrived. As successive waves of bombers entered Tokyo's airspace, the focus remained on the same neighborhoods rather than shifting across the city. Aircraft released their payloads in overlapping patterns, reinforcing areas already burning instead of dispersing damage across separate districts. Over the next several hours, the raid advanced through repetition rather than expansion. Fires spread through Honjo and Fukagawa first, then intensified as later aircraft continued to feed the same zones. The objective was not to strike once, but to sustain ignition long enough for individual fires to merge. Ignition occurred across wide sections of these neighborhoods in rapid succession. Closely packed wooden structures and narrow streets trapped heat and embers, allowing flames to spread from block to block. What began as dozens of separate fires soon consumed entire districts. Tokyo's civil defense systems responded as they had been designed to. Fire crews moved toward reported outbreaks, attempting to isolate fires before they could spread. But that approach failed almost immediately. Because fires were igniting across the same districts at the same time, response resources were divided again and again. Fire breaks proved ineffective when flames advanced from multiple directions. Fire crews were forced to abandon their positions as heat and smoke made further action impossible. After midnight on March 10th, the pattern of destruction began to change. Fires that had begun in residential blocks merged into massive fire zones. Heat rising from these areas generated strong inflows of air at street level, accelerating combustion and pulling flames into adjacent neighborhoods. Burning debris was carried ahead of the fire, igniting new areas blocks away. The spread followed the layout of the city. Districts with the densest housing burned fastest. Streets that once separated neighborhoods became channels that carried heat and embers forward. From the air, the progression was unmistakable. By around 2 a.m., a continuous glow rose over eastern Tokyo. Later bombers navigated toward the fires themselves, continuing to release incendiary bombs into areas that were already burning, which intensified the spread. The raid continued until approximately 2:30 a.m., when the final aircraft turned away. By that point, large sections of eastern Tokyo were burning uncontrollably, with no effective means of containment remaining. Only with daylight on the morning of March 10th did the full scale of the destruction become clear. Entire neighborhoods across Asakusa, Hanjo, Fukagawa, and surrounding districts had been reduced to ash. Roads were impassable. Power, water, and communication services were gone. Transportation networks were unusable. Administrative services struggled to function amid the devastation. Amongst all this, the human cost was immense. An estimated 100,000 people were killed during the raid, most by fire. More than 1 million residents were left homeless in a single night. Bodies were recovered for weeks afterward, many unidentifiable. What became clear was not that Tokyo had been uniquely fragile. It was that Tokyo had been uniquely exposed. Dense construction, district layout, environmental conditions, and civil defense doctrine had never been tested together at this scale before. Each factor alone was manageable, but combined, they produced a level of destruction that no existing system could contain. This was not the result of a single bomb or even a single decision. It was the result of sustained pressure over time. The legality of Operation Meetinghouse was never discussed during the raid itself. It was discussed afterward. Curtis LeMay, commander of the U.S. Army Air Force's 21 Bomber Command, and the officer who oversaw the shift to low-altitude incendiary attacks, later acknowledged, "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." The remark was not an expression of doubt about the raid's effectiveness, but an admission that its legitimacy could only be judged through the lens of victory. Robert McNamara, who served on LeMay's staff during the bombing campaign and would later become the United States' 8th Secretary of Defense, reflected that the raid forced uncomfortable questions about proportionality, civilian suffering, and how easily those questions could be set aside once outcomes became the primary measure of success. Operation Meetinghouse worked. It achieved a level of destruction that years of precision bombing had failed to produce. It did so not through a single decisive moment, but by sustaining pressure over time, allowing individual fires to build, interact, and overwhelm the systems that sustained the city. The destruction was not accidental. It emerged from deliberate choices made under pressure, shaped by doctrine, constraint, and limited alternatives. Operation Meetinghouse showed that modern cities could be devastated by overwhelming systems rather than precise strikes. Within weeks, the same approach was applied against other major Japanese cities during the final months of World War II. Beyond 1945, its implications carried forward into the Cold War, shaping how planners understood the vulnerability of cities and the limits of control in future conflicts. If you want more stories from history's most defining moments, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.